Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're talking about how to equip your Space Marine Legion heavy support squads. Doing an update to the previous video, so this one is from September 2022. Good time to update this now, because all of the plastic heavy weapon kits are now out for the Mark 6 Space Marine, so everyone's got really easy, cheap access to all these different guns. In this video, we're going to be talking about all the different weapon options and the equipment options as well for these squads. We're going to be talking about squad size, which is a common thing I hear questions about. Recommended loadouts for some different ways you can equip heavy support squads, and then some tactics as well that you can use on the battlefield. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and subscribe on YouTube. It really does help. And if you've got any feedback at all, drop it down in the comments below. And don't forget to join us in the Heresy Community Discord as well, which is linked in the video description below. And now on with the show. The default weapon option for the squad is the Heavy Bolter, and the Heavy Bolter is cheap and reasonably cheerful for its points. It's pretty good against weaker, more numerous targets, things like Space Marine Scouts or Ad Secularis squads, but they are pretty uncommon, and you don't really need a specialised weapon to deal with them. Generally, you should upgrade these to something better. As a rule, is probably the best way to go about it. But Imperial Fists do use these a little bit better than most people. You know, the weight of fire from hitting on a 2 can be quite good, and Iron Warriors can upgrade them to shrapnel cannons as well, which is quite cool. So for those legions, you might consider keeping the Heavy Bolter option and keeping your unit nice and cheap. The Heavy Flamer is a very different kind of weapon to most of the weapons on this list. It's obviously a close range sort of assault squad. You know, you can move and fire with the weapon as well. So that really has a very different role. Heavy Flamers are pretty good when they are actually in range of shooting something, but obviously you need to get there, which means you really need a Rhino, so the true cost of the unit is actually higher, and you really want to be shooting at squads of 10 or more enemies, really, where you can get like 7-8 hits minimum to really get great value out of these Heavy Flamer squads and the effort that you go to get them there. So I think they are usable in most legions, and it's quite a fun option to try something different in your legion by taking a bunch of Heavy Flamers. But they are particularly good in Salamanders. I think Salamanders Heavy Flamers are really good because of the extra strength and the Wall of Death. And they're also pretty good in Death Guard as well. The Death Guard ones are an upgrade over Heavy Flamers too, which might make them a bit more attractive. And the Autocannon. So I was kind of okay about Autocannons initially, but after seeing them used a few times, I think they're a bit less good than I'd hoped they'd be. They are kind of expensive for what they do, really. You know, only 2 shots, low strength, low AP without the rend, and costing 5 points isn't actually that cheap for what they do. They are good against most targets, or decent against most targets maybe, not really great versus anything, and that's their biggest strength really. They're fairly flexible, although they're not particularly fantastic at any of the things they shoot at. They do have some niche use against armor value 14 and 15 things due to the way rend works, which does make them quite powerful anti-vehicle weapons there really, especially if you're playing Iron Warriors, where they do shine quite a bit more. But even in Imperial Fists, autocannons under general use, they're not actually that great because they're just like jack of all trades but not good at any of the trades. So you probably want a more focused weapon on your squad most of the time. The missile launcher is something that I've been very impressed with when I've seen people play it and when I've tried them out. They are pretty good for shooting light to medium vehicles, which you often end up having to shoot with Lascannons and really overkill a lot of the time in your army. So, you know, a squad of missile launchers can help you with that. They're also good at just shooting into infantry and making them take a pin and test. Particularly good if you've got ways to modify the leadership depending on the legion that you're playing. And as well, one of the big things for me, they give you an anti-air option. Now, you don't need anti-air in a lot of games until suddenly someone brings some aircraft and you have a very tough game. So having that in your list sort of for free, maybe alongside some helical target and array dreadnoughts, really does help. I really like missile launchers in a small squad, just 5 of them. Nice and cheap, 135 points with an augury scanner. Gives you a unit that can do a little bit of everything reasonably effectively without costing too many points. The Multi-Melta is a very powerful weapon profile. It's accurate because it's twin linked. It's got high damage potential with its, you know, raw stats and armor bane, but it is expensive at 10 points. And the short range of these makes them really hard to use on immobile squads, like heavy support squads that are also quite squishy. You know, it's easy for your opponent to shoot them maybe before they get to do much with a weapon that's short range. So I don't think these work too well on heavy support squads, really, outside of Death Guard, who obviously do get the option to move them forward and shoot with them, which does make them quite a bit better, but they are still pretty expensive, though, even in that case. So I think multi-melta's very cool, but not actually that effective on heavy support squads. Plasma cannons are very powerful. I think they're a really good option. I think people maybe don't use them enough. They're one of the best anti-infantry options in the army, really. Plasma cannons are one of the best ways that legions can kill other Space Marines, and packing them onto heavy support squads is a great way to get yourself some powerful anti-infantry firepower. They are expensive per gun, though. Like all of these 10-point weapons, the squads do get expensive pretty fast. Plasma cannons love a Nuncio Vox somewhere in the army. When you are shooting with a blast weapon, with ballistic skill 4 and a reroll, these are super accurate compared to any other gun that's going to fire. And obviously, as well as just making sure they do hit, you're also maximizing the number of things that they hit as well. Gets hot is a real downside on these, though. Particularly, if you have taken your augury scanner and Vox in the unit, you might just find you suddenly lose that piece of equipment to get hot, which is kind of annoying. So overall, though, plasma cannons are pretty good, and I do like them, although I think they're better if you keep the squad small, because if you take big squads of plasma cannons, you might often overkill enemy units of Marines that you're shooting at and just waste those points. The Thousand Suns ether fire option's pretty good. It doesn't get hot, goes down to strength 6, which doesn't really matter because you'll still wound Marines on a 2 most of the time, but it's rending 6 instead of breaching 4, so it's probably a little bit less good as a gun, but they don't get themselves hot, so a little bit of a side grade, really. Obviously, if you do take the warp charge test with them, though, they go up to strength 8, and suddenly they're instant death and things, which can be quite good, although you'll still be looking for that rend to really get the use out of that instant death against Terminators and that kind of stuff. Wordbearer's Warfire Cannons are pretty good as well, because they're basically just plasma cannons that pin, which is the important thing, and that's a powerful thing, because Wordbearers cause fear with a lot of stuff in their army too, but they're 15 points per gun, which is very, very expensive, and they're very fragile, so I definitely wouldn't be taking those in units of more than 5. Next to Volkite Culverin, my personal favourite, and something I've used to great effect in my own hands. So these are cheap, they're high strength, they've got lots and lots of shots, and they've got Deflagrate. They're very good for 5 points a model. They are not quite good enough if they were to go up to 10 points a model, which some people think these should be. I think they'd actually be a little bit too expensive. But, at 5, they're a pretty efficient option. They're also good at hurting things like Dreadnoughts, not just infantry, because they got strength 6. So they do wound Dreadnoughts on a 5. So you can often put a couple of wounds on a Dreadnought with a full squad of these shooting at it as well, which is great. And they're just good at 2+ save targets in general. If you need to shoot Terminators, you just got a lot of shots with them, which is quite good. But they're not quite as powerful as they necessarily look when someone's throwing a bucket of dice at you, because the saves really do cut down on the damage output of these. So while they are very efficient, they're not quite as scary, particularly if you've got an Artificer Sergeant tanking some hits in the enemy unit, maybe not as efficient as they quite appear, but a very strong option nonetheless, and I highly recommend trying these if you need some anti-infantry firepower. Last but not least, we got the Lascannon, which is one of the more common options you see on heavy support squads. They are very powerful. Obviously, they're super good at killing vehicles, dreadnoughts, any hard target really. Elites like Terminators, they can instant death as well. The only problem with them is they do get expensive. Like all of these 10-point weapons, a big unit of Lascannons is a very expensive thing, and therefore very susceptible to being shot and your opponent scoring lots of points off that. But generally, that's not a reason not to take them, because they are very powerful, and I can't say anything other than to recommend Lascannons. I think they're really good, and you will see them a lot on the tabletop. The equipment options for heavy support squads, there's really 3 that you consider, and the augury scanner is basically a must-take. Pretty much you should put this in every squad. The one exception maybe if you take units of 5 of something, you could maybe shave these off because they're a bit less efficient if you've got some elsewhere in your army, but really you should probably put them on everything. They let you ignore the night fighting range penalty, they give you a free interceptor, they're just so good for 10 points. Nuncio Voxes are also pretty good, particularly obviously for the plasma in the heavy support squads, but also for other things in your army as well. You tend to be putting heavy support squads in a place where they can see lots of stuff, so they're quite good to carry the Nuncio Vox for your army. But on the flip side, sometimes it can be nice to put an Nuncio Vox on something that's a bit lower priority, like a tactical squad, so that your opponent's not shooting it off the board when they would have been shooting your heavy support squad anyway. And Artificer Armor is the last one. I think Artificer Armor is nice, but I don't think it's as auto-take as a lot of people think it is. It often gets wasted on a backfield unit. A lot of the time your opponent will be shooting your backfield unit with long-range, high-damage weapons like Lascannons or Plasma, maybe, or they will be just not shooting you at all because they're shooting something else, and your Artificer Armor kind of gets wasted. Also, as well, when you do tank hits on your Artificer Armor, your Sergeant dies makes your expensive unit easier to pin. Definitely not a must-take these. Something you might use, depending on how much you personally like it, but I think not by any means needed to include these in your heavy support squads. Let's talk about squad size. So this is one of the most common questions I get is how big should my heavy support squads be? Well, the answer is all of the numbers are really viable. The good thing about bigger squads is 15 points a model is cheaper than just buying a new heavy support squad. A new heavy support squad gets you 5 models for 100 points and takes up another heavy support slot as well. You also get a bit more economy in like your augury scanner. If you only have to buy it once on a unit of 10 models, you get more efficiency out of buying that thing. There's a few things to consider here. So, large squads are much scarier for your opponent to shoot at. And that's one of the best ways to protect your heavy support squads is just be unattractive to shoot because they're going to return fire at whatever shoots them. But on the flip side, large squads are a very attractive target for pinning and blast. If you've got enemy plasma cannons or some of the new Mechanicum stuff that's come out like the plasma mortar, shooting at a unit of 10 heavy support is very attractive and an easy way for your opponent to take points off you. And that's the downside. Or just pinning them, or anything else your opponent might use on them, like debuffs like blind and that kind of stuff too. Large squads can also be overkill against a lot of targets, so take like 10 Lascannons as an example. If you want to shoot a Predator, it's dead, but you are probably going to kill it with 5 Lascannons anyway, so you've wasted a bunch of points there. It's much less efficient splitting fire on very big units. Likewise, 10 units of plasma cannons. If you're going to shoot 10 plasma cannons at a tactical marine squad, it was probably dead with 5 plasma cannons, or mostly dead anyway, so it can be a bit of wasted points there. It's also easier to avoid a single large squad on a board with decent terrain. So I run 10 Volkite Culverins, and what I often find is while it's great to give that unit maybe the best vantage point on my side of the board, there's lots of times and lots of games where they can't shoot anything, or the opponent can just stay out their way because there's only one unit. Where you've got multiple units overlapping fields of fire, you've always got someone that can shoot at things. Small squads, though, do take up a valuable heavy support squad slot, as I've just mentioned. Heavy support slots are always at a premium in Space Marine lists because the heavy support slot is so good. And whereas small squads are good for lots of things, they inefficiently use up that slot. So depending on your army build, you might not have a problem with slots, but a lot of armies will because they'll start with the heavy support slot. So that's a consideration too. In general, if you're unsure about building a unit of heavy support and how many models you should put in it, 7 or 8 is actually quite a good number. It's gets you some of the more efficient point spend by not being a minimum size unit, but it avoids going too big for overkill. So if you're really not sure what to do, staying in that number for any weapon is a pretty good rule of thumb. Some recommended loadouts. These are ones that I personally use that I like a lot. So 7 to 10 Lascannons just gives you some really heavy firepower. Now, I say 7 to 10 because I do think 10 is usable, because there's always things like Dreadnoughts to shoot where 10 is not overkill at all. But the unit does get very expensive, and what I often end up doing is taking 10 and shaving it down by a few Marines, when I'm getting towards my points limit and I need to save some points. But somewhere around there is a good number for a big, powerful anti-tank unit. 10 Volkite Culverins and an Augury Scanner is a great unit. You can afford to go to 10 with Volkite Culverins because they're a bit on the cheap side. But also as well, shooting those 50 shots at a Space Marine unit often won't kill the whole unit because of saving throws and that kind of stuff. So you're also not going to overkill most things you shoot at with this either, especially when you lose a couple of models and you start getting shot. And I think that's a okay way to run these. Plasma cannons I like to use in 5s, again with the Augury Scanner and potentially the Nuncio Vox if you've got nowhere else in your army to put it. I often don't in the armies I'm using right now. Just really good anti-infantry firepower without overspending, without going into overkill realms when you shoot at some squads. 5 plasma cannons means they can reliably take out most of a squad of Marines every turn when they fire, which is quite good, and they're not too expensive. They're about 160 points to do that. Finally, I'm going to recommend the 5 missile launcher unit as well. If you've not tried it, particularly if you've got no anti-air in your armies, I would definitely give this a go. Just gives you lots of options every turn. You can shoot crack missiles at enemy heavy support squads. You can take out like vehicles like rhinos. You can try to pin things if you need to, or you can shoot at flyers. Just a nice little unit. If you've got the heavy support slot to put something like this in for flexibility, it can work really well. And then some tactics for heavy support squads. So this is things that I've learned over the course of 30 games, playing Iron Hands and using heavy support squads in all of those. Your start and board position is super important. You can't really move anywhere, so you need to make sure that you can see everything you need to see or you think you're going to need to see later on in the battlefield from wherever you place your unit. And if you're on a good board with decent terrain, you won't be able to see everything with a heavy support squad, so it's really important to get that right. Don't be too cagey, because bad lines of fire can really waste the unit's potential. I have had some games where I was a bit too scared of losing the unit, and they ended up just not being that effective because they couldn't see anything, which is worse than getting shot a lot of the time. But obviously you do have to care about the risk you're taking with them, because they are a very expensive unit, and if you make it too easy for your opponent to shoot them, your opponent will just take them off the board. Use the range on the heavy support squads most of the time to make it as hard as possible for the enemy to shoot them. That's just really good advice, Put them as far back as you can afford to, depending on the weapon. Try to make it as hard for your opponent to get to them, particularly with things like tactical squads that can really get a lot of value just by shooting at a heavy support squad. Make it hard for your opponent to get those things close to your squad. Pairing your heavy support squads with aggressive troops so that enemy target priority is not easy. It works really, really well. Like combined arms does work very well in Horus Heresy, which is great. Taking a big gun line with lots of shooting stuff is cool, but your opponent can come towards you. Your opponent can try to rush you in melee depending on what their army is. But if you are making a combined arms army, if you're playing some stuff that can take the fight to the enemy that they need to worry about closing with them, whether that's dreadnoughts or assault troops or something else, makes it much harder for them to just focus on your guns, and that leaves your guns free to take a real big toll on the enemy over the course of a battle. And this is particularly relevant for melee armies like World Eaters, Space Wolves, all those armies that want to run across the battlefield. Something I see with those armies a lot, and something I've been asked quite a lot on the Heresy Discord about, how do I get my Galvor back to combat? They're always getting shot. Support them with guns. A lot of people have a tendency to take all melee armies in Warhammer games, where if you've got lots of big guns at the back, your opponent's got a really tough choice. Do they shoot your guns, or do they shoot your melee stuff that's running across the board at them before it gets there? And whichever they shoot, you're up. If they shoot your guns, your melee units are, a bit less shooting on them before they get there. And if they shoot your melee stuff, it means your guns can keep on blowing their stuff up. So really do consider using these to back up assault troops. And the last thing that's really cool with heavy support squads is if you can use pinning or reaction cancelling like telepathy, or just playing around the enemy actions well with other shooting units in your army that are maybe a bit tougher, like dreadnoughts and things like that. Playing around enemy reactions to stop them shooting back at your squishy heavy support units when they do fire also really keeps them in tip-top condition. It means they can just keep taking that toll turn after turn for longer. And a well-played, well-supported heavy support squad or two really can make a big difference to the battle if you can keep them in it and keep them doing their thing every turn. So in summary, heavy support squad's a powerful unit that could easily occupy all 3 heavy support slots in any Legion army. If you wanted to, you could take nothing but these in your heavy slots and you'd do quite well. They do look cool on the tabletop. I've always loved the look of Devastators or heavy weapon arm Marines, and they give you some nice variety when you've got different weapons in the army as well. They look great, add a lot of what looks quite brutal and awesome in a Space Marine army as well. Lots of variety in the weaponry. They range from usable, heavy bolters, not great, but, usable, and heavy bolters do look cool, incidentally, as well, to very good in the Volkite, Culverins, Lascannons, Plasma, that kind of stuff. But they can be expensive and are quite fragile, so playing them with care, thinking about those tactics we've talked about without too much care and not getting use out of them is really the key to making this unit effective on the tabletop. And that's the end of the show. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit that like button and subscribe on YouTube, and any feedback you've got at all, leave it in the comments down below. And of course, don't forget to join us on the Heresy Discord community. The link to that is in the video description. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.